When both you and the narcissist go silent, the world doesn't calm down. It explodes in its own way because in that moment, someone finally loses control. And it's not you. Most people assume mutual silence means the story has ended, but the truth is far more unsettling. This is when the narcissist enters their real psychological downward spiral, and when your healing actually begins. Stay with me because what unfolds next is the part no one warns you about. If this already feels uncomfortably familiar, stay here. You need to understand the mental landscape you're stepping into because knowing this is how you break the pattern for good. Let's go deeper. When both you and the narcissist stop contacting each other, the first thing that happens on their side is what I call the recalibration phase. It's subtle, it's mental, and it's something most people overlook because it happens quietly behind the scenes, long before the narcissist takes any action. When you go quiet, you feel it as an emotional shift, a boundary, a step toward healing. But the narcissist doesn't see your silence that way. They treat it as information. Your lack of response becomes something they must figure out, not something they honor. They start evaluating how they lost their grip, not how they harmed you. Narcissists do not self-reflect the way healthy people do. Instead, they analyze you. Did you get distracted? Are you trying to punish them? Has someone else entered your life? Are you testing them? They search for an angle, a motive, a potential threat. Your silence becomes a puzzle they need to solve because uncertainty unsettles them. During this recalibration, they may not reach out at all. Their quiet is not indifference, it's strategy. They might watch your online behavior, observe your social circle, or notice who interacts with you. They're collecting data, waiting for your next emotional move. Narcissists believe that people they once controlled will always return. So your silence is not seen as closure. It's viewed as temporary resistance. This is why they don't panic immediately. Instead, they hold back, assuming you will break the silence first, just like you may have in the past. They depend on the patterns they created in you, the guilt, the fear of conflict, the desire for harmony. They expect you to bend. When you don't, their recalibration becomes more intense. They start wondering whether their influence is fading, and that's when the real threat begins for them. Silence in their world is never neutral. It is either a chance to regain dominance or a danger to their ego. And the longer you stay silent, the more they feel the ground shift beneath them because your quiet interrupts the power dynamic they relied on. When both sides go silent, the emotional experience is completely different for you than for the narcissist. And this contrast reveals an uncomfortable truth. You feel the loss, but they feel the inconvenience. When you stop reaching out, you often carry the full weight of what happened. You're sorting through the emotional wreckage, the broken trust, the unanswered questions, and the mental exhaustion. You may feel sadness, withdrawal, confusion, or guilt. You're grieving not just the relationship, but the version of yourself that tolerated so much. Your silence comes from emotional overload. You've reached a moment where your mind and body cannot take any more chaos. You're trying to reclaim space, dignity, and clarity. That internal struggle is heavy, and it affects your sleep, your self-worth, your memories, and your sense of who you are. Meanwhile, the narcissist does not interpret silence with emotional depth. They don't sit with the loss the way you do. They don't think about what went wrong or how they hurt you or what needs to change. Instead, their first reaction comes from inconvenience. Your silence interrupts their routine, not their heart. They're used to having access to your attention, your reactions, your apologies, your care, even your arguments. All of that fed their sense of importance. When you go quiet, that stream of validation instantly cuts off. This doesn't break them emotionally. It simply annoys them. They feel the absence of supply, the same way someone feels when a service they rely on suddenly shuts down. It's a disruption, a delay, an irritation. They aren't thinking, I lost someone meaningful. They're thinking, why aren't they answering? Your pain and their inconvenience exist in two very different psychological realities. You're mourning the relationship while they're inspecting their access. You're rebuilding yourself while they're calculating how your silence affects their ego. You feel the emptiness. They feel the interruption. And as time passes, this difference becomes even more obvious. You slowly start to realize how heavy the emotional load truly was and how much of yourself you muted to keep peace. They begin wondering why something that used to work so easily, your emotional responsiveness, is suddenly no longer working. The imbalance becomes visible. Your silence pushes you deeper into reflection and healing, while it pushes them into annoyance and entitlement. The emotional weight you carry is deep. The discomfort they feel is tied not to losing you, but to losing the convenience of your compliance. When both sides go silent, the narcissist does not take that quiet as a pause or mutual break. They take it as a challenge to their ego, because silence from someone they believe they controlled feels like rebellion. The narcissist sees relationships through a mindset of dominance, not mutuality. So when you stop responding, stop reaching out, and stop giving them attention, it disrupts the psychological structure they thought they built. They interpret your silence as defiance, even if you simply wanted peace or clarity. In their view, silence is never neutral. It's an offense. It's resistance. It's proof their grip might be weakening. This is why silence affects them more than any argument. Arguments give them importance. Your reactions give them fuel. Even anger reminds them they still matter in your emotional world. But silence removes them from the center, and that threatens the fragile story they depend on. Your silence forces them to face the possibility that they are not as indispensable or dominant as they imagined. Narcissists cannot tolerate uncertainty, and your lack of communication creates exactly that, a space they cannot control or interpret. Instead of seeing your silence as a healthy boundary, they treat it like a provocation. This is when their thinking becomes distorted. They may convince themselves you're being disrespectful, ungrateful, or manipulative. They may assume your silence is a tactic, not a sign of exhaustion or self-protection. Some narcissists shift into competition, seeing the silence as a battle they must win. Others frame it as betrayal, convincing themselves you abandoned them, even if they mistreated you for years. They twist the meaning of your silence to protect their ego, not to understand you. As this inner tension grows, the narcissist's sense of control weakens. Your silence becomes a mirror showing them their own insecurity. And instead of sitting with that discomfort, they start creating stories that restore their sense of superiority. They may assume you'll eventually return because you always did, or they may plan ways to punish you emotionally for not playing your part. In their mind, silence threatens their ego because it suggests something they cannot handle. You may no longer be under their psychological influence. When both sides stop communicating, something very different starts happening in them compared to you. For you, silence feels like breathing room, time to think, time to understand what you lived through. But for the narcissist, your absence creates a psychological vacuum that forces them to face something they spend their entire lives avoiding: the loss of control. They don't think in terms of mutual space or mutual boundaries. They see your silence as a break in the system they built to support their identity. Narcissists don't operate from inner worth. Their self-esteem depends on the reactions, attention, and validation of people around them. You were part of that system. Your emotions, your responses, your pattern of returning after conflict, all of that strengthened their sense of power. When you go quiet, you interrupt that system, and that interruption exposes them. It forces them to face their dependence on your attention, something they don't want to admit. They built a story where they were the one in control. Your silence challenges that story. Without your reactions, they have nothing to push against, nothing to manipulate, no evidence of their power. This absence becomes a threat not because they care about you in a real emotional way, but because it shakes the foundation of control that made them feel important. This is when their inner world grows restless. They may replay conversations, look for clues, wonder if someone else has taken their place, or check for ways to reassert dominance. The silence becomes louder for them than it does for you because they don't know what's happening on your side. That lack of visibility removes their illusion that they can predict you. They are suddenly outside of your world instead of at the center of it. And that loss is unbearable for them. Their mind shifts from arrogance to anxiety, from entitlement to suspicion, from confidence to instability, all triggered by your absence. When both you and the narcissist fall into silence, it may look like nothing is happening, but internally, the narcissist begins moving through predictable behaviors to restore control. One common reaction is trying to fill the void your absence created through hoovering, baiting, or triangulation. These are not random behaviors. They are psychological tools used when they feel their influence fading. Hoovering begins when they realize your silence isn't temporary. At first, they assume you'll return because they conditioned you in that pattern. When you don't, panic starts. Hoovering is their attempt to pull you back, not because they value you emotionally, but because losing you threatens their ego. They may send a soft message, bring up a memory, or fake a crisis. They may act sorry, thoughtful, or suddenly attentive. They change their tone based on what they think will draw you in. The goal is not connection, it's control. If hoovering doesn't work or feels too vulnerable, they switch to baiting. Baiting is meant to provoke an emotional reaction, positive or negative. Narcissists don't care which way your emotions go, they only care about being the cause. They might post something online to trigger jealousy, send a sharp message to make you angry, or create drama to force a response. Any reaction gives them relevance again. Silence strips them of power, so baiting becomes their way to poke at the wound they caused, hoping you'll react just enough to remind them you're still reachable. When those tactics fail, they escalate to triangulation. This is when they pull someone else into the situation, a new partner, an ex, a friend, a family member, not for real connection, but to create a story that puts them back in control. They might show off a new relationship, hint that someone else appreciates them more, or twist your silence to make themselves look like a victim. The purpose of triangulation is to make you feel insecure, replaced, or insignificant. It's meant to push you into defending yourself or returning to the dynamic. These behaviors aren't signs of love. They're signs of dependence. The narcissist needs outside supply to maintain a sense of identity. When you remove that supply, they scramble to fill the gap. Hoovering, baiting, and triangulation are ways to regain dominance, not closeness. Their reactions come from fear, entitlement, and damaged ego, all triggered by you. Our silence. When the silence continues, something unexpected begins. While you may see the quiet as a step toward peace or closure, the narcissist experiences it as growing unease. Your silence is not seen as calm. It's seen as losing control. Their identity depends on emotional stimulation from others. They need attention, admiration, conflict, anything that puts them at the center. When you stop feeding that, they feel an inner collapse. They don't know how to regulate themselves without external feedback, and your silence removes that feedback. At first, they may pretend they don't care. They may act distant or unaffected, but it's just a mask. As time goes on, the silence becomes harder to ignore. Without your attention, their inflated self-image starts to crack. They feel insignificant, overlooked, and irrelevant. These feelings are unbearable because they touch their deepest fear, being ordinary or unimportant. While you use silence to rebuild yourself, they experience that silence as a threat to their identity. Your nervous system begins to calm, the tension fades, the mental fog clears. You start remembering who you were before the chaos. Your silence brings healing. Theirs brings instability. They begin overthinking, imagining scenarios, trying to guess why you're no longer responding. They don't miss the relationship. They miss the reflection of themselves they saw in your reactions. Your silence heals you. Theirs unravels them. You regain parts of yourself. They lose parts of the identity they constructed. What feels freeing for you becomes frightening for them. This difference exposes the imbalance that existed the whole time. The quiet sets you free while it slowly dismantles them from within. When the silence settles, something shifts inside you in a way that feels slow, confusing, and surprisingly comforting. Your nervous system, which has been living in constant alert, finally gets a chance to stop bracing for impact. Narcissistic relationships create long-term hypervigilance. You learn to predict their moods, reactions, and emotional unpredictability. Your body becomes trained to expect tension, even when things seem calm. So when silence begins, your system doesn't relax immediately. At first, it doesn't know how. You may feel uneasy or restless in the quiet. You may think the lack of conflict means something is wrong. That reaction isn't weakness, it's biology. Your body has been surviving, but as time passes, the fog fades. Your mind untangles from the chaos. You notice how your thoughts shift when you're not waiting for their next outburst. Your sleep slowly improves. You start feeling moments of peace you haven't felt in a long time. This is your nervous system adjusting, recognizing the danger is gone. This is the beginning of true healing. the kind that doesn't need permission, apology, or closure from them. This is when you start reclaiming emotional space that was once drained by their needs and dramas. You rediscover your ability to think clearly, to feel your own emotions without someone twisting them, and to make choices based on your own values instead of living on constant alert. You begin to feel yourself returning after being buried under emotional weight for so long. Small things start to feel different. You notice that your body isn't as tense when you wake up. You're not checking your phone with the same fear or urgency. You're not rehearsing conversations in your mind or preparing for sudden shifts in mood. Slowly, your nervous system starts to trust the silence. It starts to understand that the storm has passed. And in that quiet, something powerful begins to grow, clarity. You start to see the relationship for what it truly was, not what you hoped it could be. You recognize the ways you minimized your own needs, how often you apologized when you did nothing wrong, how much of yourself you suppressed just to keep the peace. These realizations are painful, but they're also freeing because they show you how deeply you were conditioned. The silence becomes your teacher. It helps you understand the patterns, the cycles, and the emotional traps you couldn't recognize before. You start to see how your kindness was used, how your empathy was drained, and how your desire to fix things kept you stuck in a situation that only harmed you. As this awareness grows, so does your strength. You begin healing in ways that feel slow but steady. You gain emotional space to think, to breathe, to remember who you were before the chaos. You reconnect with parts of yourself that were ignored or silenced. You start to feel emotions that belong to you, not ones controlled or manipulated by someone else. You realize the silence isn't empty. It's full of your own voice returning. Meanwhile, the narcissist experiences none of this. Their silence doesn't bring healing. It brings irritation, restlessness, and fear of losing control. They don't use the quiet to reflect or change. They use it to plot, to calculate, to question how they can regain the power they believe. Slipping away. But you're no longer feeding their ego. You're no longer dancing in their emotional maze. And with each day that passes, your silence becomes less about them and more about you reclaiming yourself. Your nervous system keeps adjusting. The world feels less heavy. You have more mental clarity. You begin trusting your intuition again. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself or prove your worth to someone who never truly saw it. Instead, you start valuing your peace. You begin choosing yourself, sometimes for the first time in years. The silence that once felt unsettling now feels necessary. It becomes the space where you learn to live without fear, without confusion, without constant emotional pressure. The more comfortable you become in this quiet, the more you realize how loud the relationship truly was, how it filled your mind, your heart, and your life with noise that wasn't yours. And the more you settle into this peaceful silence, the more you understand the power it holds. Your silence is not a weakness, it's not avoidance, it's not a game. It's healing, it's reclaiming, it's building a new emotional foundation that cannot be controlled by someone else. And without realizing it, you've stepped into a version of yourself that is stronger, clearer, and more grounded than before. Your silence becomes a space where your true self begins to rise again.